I'm just walking back to my hotel after my last day at Kennedy Krieger, which is at John Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. So this has been a wildly different week from last week, where I was looking at trauma-informed care with the sanctuary. So yeah, very therapeutic, thoughtful, non-clinical response to how we can support organisations. Whereas this week I've been in a hospital setting all week, and they've been incredibly welcoming. They've flung the doors wide open, so I've been able to visit the Child Psychiatry Unit and the Neuro-Behavioural Unit, which was the one I was really interested in, and various other outpatients clinics, with a focus of thinking about with the young people with severe intellectual disabilities and autism who go into crisis, which are the services that they end up in? Where do they end up being supported in terms of needing chronic emergency intervention? And actually what they've been talking about is that those young people are ending up in all the settings. So in a mainstream psychiatric unit, they are ending up supporting young people with severe intellectual disabilities and autism, because it's not clear where they should go. And so the Neuro-Behavioural Unit is one of probably the very few places in the States, or maybe even in the world, that that specialises and focuses purely on this population. And they have extraordinary levels of experience with young people with self-injurious behaviour. So it was an absolute privilege to go and visit that setting and to see what they're getting up to. I have a lot of reflections about what they do. But what was also interesting is, so this is a medical model, so that we're talking about care that is highly medicalised, through psychiatry and a diagnosis and treatment, and then they also add on a significant and evidence-based behavioural interventions, so based on ABA, that are very thorough and pretty effective as well. But the piece that I'm bringing in, which is this idea of at what point do we need to consider whether a young person in front of us is traumatized rather than having a medical or a behavioral issue. This is not massively within their thinking. And I guess what was interesting to me was bringing that piece into this setting. I was pretty nervous. This is not the setting that is normally open to that kind of thing. But certainly at the MBU, they were really thoughtful about it. And then they also have a whole trauma department. So they have a department that focuses on traumatic stress in young people and families. And meeting with that group was really fascinating as well, to think about, so they see young people both with and without intellectual disabilities. But it still feels early days for them, and still trying to work out what do we do when we have a young person who's nonverbal, who has complex behaviour and a complex presentation, and who we suspect is also part of their presentation is a response to the adverse experiences they've had. So it's just been fascinating to engage on a very different level, not in the kind of therapeutic spaces that I've been able to engage with, but in a very medicalised environment. What openness is there to these conversations? And I'd say some places I've been into, I felt like we're on the same page. Some places I've been into, I felt like they're horrified because I'm not bringing a medicalised view of the young people that we're talking about. But ultimately, it's been a privilege to be here and for them to open their doors to me and allow me to come in and discuss and converse about these things. And I guess the takeaway piece for me has been, certainly when my first conversation with the NBU, I talked about what we were attempting to do, you know, that we were trying to develop models, therapeutic models to support really complex young people who self-injure or have trauma presentations. And we're trying to do that to stabilise them and to build resilience into the residential non-clinical settings that are supporting them. And the bigger picture here is that this piece of work has the potential to prevent young people going into clinical services. And in adulthood, we obviously in the UK have a huge problem with people with learning disabilities and autism ending up in mental health units. Actually, if we can do good enough work and thoughtful enough work at the stage of adolescence, we have the potential to prevent adults with learning disabilities and autism going into mental health units in the long term, because we've taken the time in adolescence to understand what's actually going on for them and find meaningful and sustainable ways forward. And I think presenting that piece of the puzzle and that narrative, probably one of the repeated conversations I've had is this is really needed. Once young people like this are in a clinical setting, then the medical model rolls. But actually, we just haven't got enough space. We haven't got enough capacity. We can't meet the needs of all of the young people. So actually, for there to be some preventative work to prevent this happening in the first place, they were saying, like, you're in the right place. These are the conversations we need to have. So that's been really encouraging. And I know as well in the UK, we have a crisis with having people with learning disabilities and autism in mental health settings. And there's two pieces in my mind to think about around that. One is how do we do the person-centred care, transforming care piece that brings those who are stuck in mental health units, they shouldn't be there, out and into the community in a sustainable way. And secondly, how do we prevent the inflow? How do we prevent young people and young adults ending up in those spaces in the first place? And it feels like to engage with the most challenging young people and young adults with self-injury and to consider that as potential trauma presentations and to think therapeutically around that is a preventative piece because we want to change the system long term. We don't want this to be an ongoing conversation. So yeah, it feels like being here has helped me to pull back on what we're wanting to do at Unique Connections and see it not just as a needed piece for those young people in the here and now, but that we are potentially doing preventative work that means that they can remain in the community being supported in ways that by people that understand their needs and understand what's happening for them, which means that they don't have to come anywhere near the equivalent that we have in the UK to psychiatric units or even Neuro-Behavioural units. So yeah, a week that's given me a great deal to think about.